Hi, welcome to Viola da Gamba tutorial number 13. This is going to be part one of a multi-series subset of tutorials about French ornamentation. I've had quite a few requests from my members to discuss the various mysterious symbols that appear in all French music for the viol. And because this is such a massive topic, I thought it would be best to divide it into individual videos for each separate ornament. We're going to start with trills, which are probably the most common and important ornaments to be found in French music. And there's a wide variety of situations in which you encounter them, musically speaking, and an array of approaches to performing them from a technical standpoint. I'm going to include a variety of sort of short examples of various types of trill, together with how to get around them technically, and then I'll have a brief example of some trills being put into practice. To start with, it's worth noting as a forward to this complete subset of videos that ornaments for the French were particularly important, not just as a sort of traditional decoration for music, but as an expressive device, a rhetorical device in their own right. And ornaments were closely linked to the spoken word, especially poetic declamation and declamation on the stage. And since composers like Marais took as their main expressive model the human voice, it's important to understand what vocal teachers and vocal professionals were discussing in relation to ornaments and how they should be performed. One of the sort of most thorough writers on this subject was Bénigne de Bassilly, who wrote a treatise on singing in 1668, and he goes into enormous detail not only about the proper pronunciation of French when singing, but also how to compose for the voice and how to perform ornaments. Interestingly, he describes ornaments not as just decorations, but rather as indications of length. And what he means by that is that because for the French the rhythms of language were a form of expression in themselves, the distribution of long and short syllables, the way you mark those long syllables in music not only provided a melodic or maybe a harmonic interest to that piece, but it also brought out those expressive rhythms. So writers of poetry would select a particular pattern of long and short, just as English composers did, although there were differences in the arrangement, in order to produce a specific effect. So Bassi marks various different ornaments with different lengths, and so some ornaments are used for particularly long syllables and some for particularly short ones. The trill is one of the longest, which is to say it's to be used on some of the longest syllables you would find in song or indeed in poetry. So with that in mind, we'll proceed, and I might make reference to some French words in the following material, just as an illustration. The confusing thing about French ornaments is, well, one of the confusing things is that composers used different terminology and to a certain extent different symbols to represent those ornaments. In the case of the trill, well, in fact, in the case of ornaments in general, Marais really established a system that was copied by pretty much everybody from Forqueray to Louis de Quai d'Evrellois, Charles Dolé. De Machy also uses most of Marais' symbols to mean the same things. But there were various terms specifically for the trill that varied amongst that group of composers. So generally, though, a trill was referred to as a cadence or a tremblement. When Italian music started to find its way into French society, some composers decided to adopt more Italianate ornament symbols, and that often means that not only are the symbols different, but actually there are fewer of them. The French were peculiarly precise in prescribing which ornaments should be played exactly where and when. So they had a large array of symbols. So for the trill, we're going to just concentrate on the one symbol for this video. The one that Marais established is a comma after the note to be trilled. In the case of composers like Boismortier, who adopted the Italian system, he simply uses a cross, and occasionally he uses a wavy line, which is confusing on a number of levels, but we'll get to that. So the basic trill in French music is almost always approached from above. So if you're trilling on a G, for example, the G would be written in the music, but you would trill from the note above that. Trills are also usually associated with the upper note being slightly lengthened, so that you have this effect of speeding up the trill as you play it. One of the things that I come across quite frequently with students is that they see a trill and immediately start to pack in as many trills or as many oscillations as they can fit into the time. And this is both very difficult, it makes it very difficult to perform a trill, but it's also historically perhaps not quite justified. Bénigne de Bassilly himself has one of my favourite quotes on this issue. He says, he approaches it from the perspective of people playing trills too slowly. He says, concerning a cadence or a trill which is too slow, it might be said that this deficiency is like the bride being too beautiful, since slowness in a cadence is an advantage, provided that it gets a bit faster at the end than it was at the beginning. So we can take from this that as the trill progresses, you can speed up a little bit, but initially less is more in terms of speed. So let's have a look at a sort of basic trill. So in French music, as I say, it's represented by a comma next to the note. So in this very brief extract from Marais' Grand Ballet, this is book 3, there are two ornaments indicated in this extract. We'll just concentrate on the second one for now. It's a G sharp, so we know that we're going to have to start on the upper note, the note above the written note, so in this case an A. And it's relatively short. It's not going to be influenced too heavily by any of the rhythms around it. So let's just play this slowly and work our way through it. So the first ornament on the second note in this excerpt is a battement, which I will play, but we'll discuss it in a future video. Okay, so I make sure to preserve the rhythm as I play through it, and instead of playing the G sharp as it's written, I instead play an A, and that A lingers through maybe a quarter of the value of the note, and then I start to oscillate. So I move from my fourth finger, which is stopping the A on the E string, to my third finger, which is stopping the G sharp. And because it's not a particularly long trill, we've only got a crotchet's worth, a quarter note's worth to fill. I don't need to worry about filling it with oscillations, which is more difficult and actually sounds more confused to the audience. So I'm actually, if I slow it down a lot, I'm only going. So this is not a big movement and doesn't require a lot of agility in the fingers. And the whole process is made easier by the fact that you can take up some of the time of the note by holding on to the upper note. So you have even less time to fill with the trill oscillations. Trilling on the fourth finger is by far the most difficult finger to use for a trill. And A good exercise to practice your trills and to strengthen your fingers is simply to sit there and do variations on a trill slowly. So you might start with first finger to second finger. So you would play, starting on the upper note, remember. And then you'd graduate to third finger to first finger. And then, since we only ever trill between a semitone and a tone, you can shift at that point to oscillating between your second finger and your third finger. This can be quite difficult. And then your fourth finger and your second finger. And then fourth to third, and this is the most difficult. And the idea is then to speed it up. So you can use a metronome if you like, but you can eventually go from to and so on. To help speed up, you can also introduce rhythmic variation by using a sort of more dotted rhythm, such as this. And so on and so forth for every combination of fingers. And if you do this for 5 minutes a day, you will strengthen your fingers and the tendons that govern the lifting and placing of the fingers, and it should start to make trills a little easier to accomplish. So in addition to trills just on individual notes in regular duple time, there are certain other situations you can find trills. The first is as a sort of passing ornament within a group of shorter notes, often notes that are tied under a slur. Here's another example from Marais. And notice that the trill at the end of this extract is you're trilling a quaver or an eighth note that's tied as a larger group of notes. And the implication here is that because we start on the upper note, the effect is that the C in this case is held over. So it acts almost like a miniature dotted rhythm within that passage of quavers. So again, this is going to be quite a quick trill, so we don't want to have too many oscillations, but perhaps the oscillation should be fairly quick to give that impression of detail, of a filigree ornament, even if there are not lots of oscillations. So it's I'm doing perhaps 2 or 3 oscillations. If I do it very slowly, I'm going. So. So the effect is starting on the upper note, but then releasing it and then replacing the finger almost immediately. It's barely a trill, but it's because it passes relatively quickly, it sounds more complex than it actually is. In Boismortier, speaking of alternative symbols, he uses a wavy line for this type of trill, a trill that's tied across. And he's not very consistent about this, and confusingly, that horizontal wavy line is used in Marais' system for a type of vibrato, which we'll talk about in another video. So it's best to separate this Italianate form of ornament symbology with the other stuff. This is a separate system. So the effect in Boismortier's writing is exactly the same as it is in Marais' writing. The wavy line seems to indicate the fact that you are holding the previous note in the tie over the trill. So the effect is exactly the same as Marais' comma. He's just contextualized it in a slightly different manner. So here's this excerpt from Boismortier. This is the Opus 10. Another contexts in which you'll find trills are in dotted rhythms, and you'll most commonly find this at cadence points at the end or in the middle of pieces, or at the end of major phrases. Dotted rhythms with trills can be approached in one of two ways. You can either use this as an excuse to trill for longer, or according to some authors, you can or you are expected to hold the upper note, the French call this the appui, the leaning note, for the full value of the note itself while trilling only in the time of the dot. So if you're playing a dotted crotchet, dotted quarter note, you would hold the upper note for the value of the quarter note, the crotchet, and then trill for the value of the quaver, the value that is added by the dot. Generally speaking, people tend to sort of do a mix of these. It's nice to lean particularly heavily on the upper note, the appui, for these trills, but there's a certain amount of freedom, I think, essentially. So here's an example of a dotted crotchet trill from Marais. This again is a cadential trill. It's also double stopped, so it's worth bearing in mind that you'll need to preserve some bow length, because you're essentially playing an entire minim, and then before transitioning to the cadence chord itself. It's very easy to let the bow move too quickly while playing trills as you start thinking about different things. So worth considering bow conservation. So that's a version where the trill is more immediate. Alternatively, you can hold the upper note for the duration of that first crotchet. So if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. This works exactly the same way in Vimontier's music. In the excerpt here, we have a wavy line, which again, you'd have thought he'd use a plus sign across for this particular trill, but perhaps he's trying to indicate that the first trill on the falling 16th notes is less important than the trill on the beginning of the cadence. So let's see how that might sound. Or if we hold the upper note longer. So not too much to worry about with these trills. Where trills start to become a little more complex, however, is where composers start to use so-called compound ornaments, which is to say they join different types of ornaments together. So I've taken an example again from Vimontier's Opus 10. And in this example, we have two types of compound ornament. The first is particularly complicated. He uses a port de voix, a sort of a little filling in note, to lead into the trill, and then he terminates the trill with more petite notes perdues, these little filler notes. So at the end of a cadential trill, you'll quite often see what's called a termination. So if I give you an example of that. So that little is a termination. Usually the French write that in. In Italian music, it's often not written in, and it's up to the performer to decide whether to perform it or not. But in this example, Vimotier has written it out, and because the movement is relatively quick, we don't have very much time for the trill if we're going to fit in the little extra notes. So here's how that might sound. I'll do that again. So I've not spent much time on the upper note of the trill, and I'm also using a little bit of inégalité, the unequal bow strokes that the French loved so much. So all of these ornaments are really tucked in. I'll do it again. Now, immediately after that, we've got another compound ornament that's very, very common in French vowel music and is very closely related to language. It's called the tierce coulée, or the sort of falling third. And it consists of a trill followed by a second note ornamented with a port de voix. And this was, in vocal music, used to illustrate a linguistic feature unique to French, which is the atonic E, the E that is mostly silent in spoken French, but in declaimed French in the 17th and 18th centuries was pronounced quite strongly. So a good word is the word gloire, glory. This is, in poetical terms, gloire, the first syllable, is very strong because it precedes this r sound. And the r sound itself falls away, but is very clear. So Lully came up with this manner of setting it to music by employing a trill. Remember, this is Bassilly's longest indication of length on the gloire syllable, and then the falling away of the third with the port de voix in the middle represents the r. Linguistically, that's a schwa sound, it's a sound, and it's not accented. So it's important to accent that first trill and then come away, so diminuendo, on the falling third that follows. So you can imagine somebody declaiming gloire, gloire. So the is really weak, whereas the trill is strong with a long appui, or initial note. So this whole bar and a bit sounds like this. So although these trills often look really complicated on paper, once you break them down into their basic components, they're actually very approachable. The only thing that becomes tricky is just training your fingers to move quickly enough to achieve the number of oscillations you want. The third, indeed fourth situation that one finds trills is in combination with double stops. And in this situation, it's often necessary to use fingers that you might not otherwise expect to use for a trill. A really good example is the opening of Maré's Les Voix Humaines. This has lots of different ornaments throughout the piece, but the opening theme really contains a lot of chordal trills. Let's have a look at that now. By the way, it starts with a flattement, this uniquely French vibrato-y sound, which we'll cover in a future video, but particularly indicative of quite passionate music. So this requires some complex fingering. I, in fact, end up trilling on a fourth finger with an open string while playing parallel fingers, which is really quite awkward and can be accomplished either by lifting and placing the finger or actually by rocking the hand to a certain extent, sometimes a combination of the two. So when approaching chordal versions of trills, it's worth breaking them up again into the basic shapes. So the initial trill here, I'm unusually trilling not the top string that I'm playing, but actually the next string down, the middle string of the chord. And again, I'm using a parallel finger to play the D, with a third finger on the on the F and a first on the F natural, F sharp and a first on the F natural. So I don't have much space, but it is possible to lift and place the finger. So when you get to this kind of situation, it's worth, again, practicing, like I said, the that exercise, but in the position that you need to assume for the trill. Sorry. And then gradually speed it up. Again, the fact that you should lean into and hold the initial upper note is your friend here. So you could actually hold it because it's a dotted rhythm. If you find the trill difficult, you can reduce the number of oscillations quite drastically by holding on to the upper note for the duration of that initial note value. So you could actually get away with. So it's worth breaking these situations down into more basic bite-sized chunks and then practicing those elements individually and making a decision as to the nature of the trill itself based on ideally musical thinking, but if necessary technical ability as well. I hope you've found that video enjoyable and useful. In a future video we will be addressing other ornaments such as the battement, or what we'd call a mordant, various types of vibrato, and the port de voix, the leaning note. Those videos will be forthcoming as soon as I can make them. And in the meantime, if you would like to practice any of this, there is some French Baroque music on my Patreon service, some Wemortier and Couperin, and more will be added soon. So if you'd like to play along with a continuo part, I can recommend that service. You can sign up for a monthly fee at patreon.com/Sam Stadlen. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, or even leaving a comment, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I'll see you in the next video.